begin the debate once you see the live on YouTube. Oh, okay, so it's live on YouTube. We can type the debate.
Okay, so we have consent from the second speaker for the closing opposition then?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I'm just putting that in the chat.
No, don't worry. I am the chat.
Okay. Okay. Looks like we're all ready to go then. Okay, welcome everyone to the quarterfinals of Malaysia ABP, and I'll be your chair for this round. Can I have everyone on the panel introduce themselves, please? You're welcome to do gender pronoun introductions in the chat if you'd like to do that, since we're already being live streamed.
Hi, I'm Adel. Fine with you or they? Okay, Adel here. Fine with you or they?
Just want to check if we have all other members of the panel on the call, because I cannot see them. Okay, so we'll just be contacting them to let them know that we are going to be moving to the main session, because they might have just gone to the link instead.
Estelle, can I get a confirmation who the panel that we're waiting for? I can look for them.
So the panel that we're waiting for, Upper Team, Connor, and Ufi should be joining us. In the meantime, can I just ask that all the teams then introduce themselves in their speaking order so that we can have that? And if you're more comfortable sharing gender preferences in the chat, you're welcome to do that as well. Starting with Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister. Can I know who's speaking first for OG? Do we have Atul and Daniel in the chat in the call?
Yep, we're here.
Cool. Can you guys let me know who's speaking first, please? We're doing introductions now.
Okay, so I'll be speaking first, Daniel, and Atul will be speaking second, and we have no preferred gender pronouns.
Yeah, we're also being live streamed as well in this room. So anyone who wants to share gender pronouns, if you've missed that, you can share that in the chat. Can I then have opening opposition speaking order?
Hello, I'm Miko. I'm speaking first. Ignacio will speak second.
Closing government.
Jamal will be speaking as member and Pushkar as whip.
Okay, and then closing opposition.
Hannah speaking first, Shiode, Etiza speaking second, Shiode.
Okay, and now it looks like we have all of the judges who have joined us, so may I ask the panel to then introduce themselves?
Hi, Connor, no preferred pronouns.
Hi, my preferred pronouns he and they.
Hi, this is Upi here, there, please.
Okay, looks like we're all here. Okay, so 2 things on timekeeping. I'll be keeping time and putting stamps in the chat so you know when to finish. Please wrap up before 7:15. We won't be taking notes after. And then, I think that's it. Offering POIs, please do so in the chat. At 5 minutes, you can unmute. On this house, as an altruistically minded graduate would follow the 80,000 hours approach to their professional career rather than joining an altruistic organization, I asked the Prime Minister to open this debate. Here.
Hi, I I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, awesome. Just give me a second. I'll just start my timer. Okay. All right. I'll be accepting POIs in the chat, so please don't unmute yourselves. Thank you. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Go. We think the world is extremely problematic. There are a lot of individuals that are extremely poor. We see women who are extremely uneducated in various areas of the world. We see trans individuals, etc., facing a lot of hate crimes where they're not even given jobs based on their identity, where they're structurally oppressed from various systems that they're born within, where individuals more often than not, especially from racial minorities, don't get access to the basic things like healthcare, etc., despite laws being there on paper that necessarily go and support them. We think these are sort of things that we necessarily want to go ahead and solve as an altruistic individuals. There are 2 key aims as an altruistic individual in this debate that suits your self-interest. Number 1, we think you necessarily want to create the most out of the sort of resources and the sort of capital and the sort of value that you have. And number 2, you want to create the most amount of positive change. This is really important to note because this is where the debate is going to lie. Sure, on both worlds, you will be a good individual, but what is going to be best for your self-interest is in which world are you going to create a more or a higher amount of change that will directly impact the sort of individual that you want to help. So a couple of things I'll be talking to you about. Number 1, I'll be talking about how does the ATR's system work? What do they do? How do they advise individuals? 2, I'll be talking about what are the different possible ways to create change through the ATR system by working with various things that were suggested. And lastly, I'll be talking about why this is better than the alternative that is working directly in these organizations, right? So firstly, with regards to how ATRs will work, 80,000 hours will work. We think at the point, the way it works is necessarily you go and join with this organization by virtue of doing one of the job that they suggest you to do. And while you're at that job during that time, they will always go ahead and try to conduct their research and will always advise you based on what is the best thing for you to do. That is, okay, this is what, if you're working at a bank and you're making good amount of money, this is how you should spend your money. What are the most effective ways to go ahead and do it? Where should you donate? And all these things, right? Moreover, like if you are working in research firms, etc., you will always be given advice based on things like, how you're going to, like what you should try to put your research on, what is going to create this additional impact and all these things. Because the focus right now from 80,000 hours, the organization, is to ensure that you are going to create a lot of additional impact based on what you're apart from the role that you're already working in. So what are the different ways through which we can uniquely create positive change, right? First of all, understand that the world still lacks a lot of individuals who are willing to go ahead and give a lot of money towards different things. We think the world is shifting towards a world where individuals are more often than not becoming more individualistic. That is, individuals are less likely to go ahead and donate to certain areas because of the world becoming more cynical in a way, because they believe that nothing is really working. You go ahead and read news about how the organization that you donate to like literally spend 3 cents on the dollar. You go ahead and see that the world is getting screwed over no matter what. You lose faith in certain systems and all these things, which is why there's a lot of individuals who just focus on just doing the capitalistic thing, just focusing on themselves. Which is why we think in this world, what is unique is that you are the one to fill that gap. You are the one to go ahead and use that money because you realize the value of altruism. You still have that faith in the fact that you can change the system, and that is the one thing you can do to directly benefit certain individuals by virtue of going ahead and doing this. You can use your money to go ahead and ensure that you can directly fund individuals like women, etc., within your area, like people who are underfunded and all these things. You can directly fund their education, make sure that they can go to university, probably all these things. Next, you can go ahead and ensure that you can fund businesses, right? This is really important. Understand, when you work in an organization, etc., you can't go ahead and do these things necessarily. When you work for like a charity and all these things, they're trying to go ahead and like probably do a lot of other things within that organization. Within that organization itself, you have to still work on trying to build networks so that people will support your organization. You're still going ahead and continuously churning out to make sure that you get some sort of marketing so that people will know about your organizations in the first place when you're working in a charity. There's so many things that are already wasted when you're in that time, right? But in our world, when you can directly use this money, you can like you can be like a VC itself, where you go ahead and invest money in various individuals' businesses. You can empower individuals to create wealth by themselves by virtue of you supporting trans businesses, black businesses, like going ahead and supporting like women-led startups and all these things. This directly empower a lot of individuals. Why? Because these startups are unique in a way that they understand the various issues. That means when you suppose I fund a women-led startup, I'm more likely going to help a lot more other women because they realize the value of women in the workforce itself. That means I'm creating much more additional impacts based on just funding one individual for their business itself, right? Next, in terms of research as well, that is something we'll be getting, right? At the time of which, sure, it's long term, but it's really important. What do we mean? When you go ahead and get into a research firm as well, you can go ahead and spend time to research about things like women's issues, going ahead and strengthening evidence for finding out whether the wage gap is necessarily true or not, going ahead and finding evidence to go ahead and see how like various structures like the police, etc., use things like qualified immunity to go ahead and necessarily like oppress individuals from racial minorities. How you can go ahead and ensure that you can collect more data to strengthen the proof that okay, there is a lot of hate crime against trans individuals, against black individuals in various areas. And these things are necessarily working. Why? Because the way you go ahead and do this is like you work in a public policy firm, and in these public policy firms work hand in hand with governments, where you necessarily go ahead and change different laws. The reason these public policy firms are really important is because governments heavily rely on them to collect that data, to collect that evidence, so that they can go ahead and necessarily create that change. Because the only way people will agree to any change is because based on evidence, because that is the sort of world that we're living in, and we think we can use our resources over here to go ahead and use that within this research as well. Next, with regards to things like creating change from within these MNCs as well, we think side opposition will come and tell that, oh, working with MNCs is so bad because these MNCs have necessarily become so rich by virtue of capitalism, and capitalism is probably based on certain bad things. We will concede to that, but we think there are a lot of changes that can directly impact anyways. Because look at the alternative. In their world, these capitalistic firms will still exist. What we can do uniquely is to create additional impacting in terms of what you can do within the organization. There are plenty of examples. So understand the point at which you can probably like grow up, you network, you and assume this individual is probably smart and probably has a lot of value. At that point of time, more often than not, by virtue of going up, you get a lot of opportunities within MNCs itself. Recently, an individual within JPMC has created an initiative to put $30 billion into helping individuals through various means, like going ahead and improving access to housing, improving access to easy loans, going ahead and ensuring that you empower more black individuals, going ahead and doing all these things. We think these are sort of CSR things that you can do within your organization by virtue of going ahead and getting these opportunities uniquely from MNCs. Moreover, MNCs themselves are trying to get these increase the CSR. So we think at that point of time, you can again create change from within. That is something that we can uniquely do. Then why is this lastly better than the alternative? Understand, in the alternative, you don't have a lot of additional impacting you can do, right? Again, you're competing with other charities, you're competing with other organizations over there. That means you necessarily have to work on doing all the groundwork, and then only you can move to impacting individuals, which means I have to still go ahead and market my organization. I have to still go ahead and beg for funding. I have to still go ahead and like network, etc., to get all these things so that I can finally go ahead and help individuals. Which means in their world, when it is so difficult to directly impact individuals, on a comparative, we are the ones to create additional impacting. We are the ones to create additional change through the sort of work that we do and through the sort of wealth that we create. We're very proud to win this one.
Thank you for that speech, Prime Minister. Now can we have the Leader of Opposition?
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, I can hear you.
Please. Alright, a minute. Alright, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. The clash is simple. We would prefer to directly work with charitable organizations, NGOs, etc., rather than just pay them off and hope that throwing money at them is going to do any good. I have two main points of our substantive. It'll be largely responsive to the previous speaker. The first is on the personal fulfillment you get from doing good. Second is simply a moral claim as to whether or not you're going to do more good on our side or on theirs. Firstly, I'm just going to explain that you have to do a lot of evil things in order to get any sort of corporate success. Note, this response to the argument coming from PM that says, well, you could possibly change the corporate structure when it's unclear to me how you can do that as one individual. And here are a few reasons why. The first is that these organizations pay high salaries because they're highly profitable, not just because they're core like pillars of the economy. It is because they cut corners. It is because they know how to structure themselves in ways that prioritize profit over the human being. So if you want to win court cases in developing countries, you often have to pay off your local judge and ensure that you can win that court case. Or even in a developed country, the way that banks work is that you have to ensure you can create the interest rate high enough for poor individuals to opt in, but low enough for them to opt in, but high enough for them to default and give up their collateral. Or you just outright deny them. Make sure Black families do not have the capacity to access loans for cars or housing. Take note, you are one individual. Any person who is willing to do this more than you, because your altruism is not an advantage in this kind of field, it is a disadvantage. Any person more willing to do this is more likely to get hired, more likely to get promoted. You have to be willing to work within this structure, or else you are seen as bad for the corporation because you are unable to provide the same returns on investment that anyone else is likely to be able to do. And given that many people are willing to work in this field because of the individualistic, capitalistic nature of society, government says you are highly replaceable and therefore unlikely to succeed with any increasing reform you try and posit on government bench. So take note. You have to directly contribute to a lot of evil that is done in this world, precisely because even mere participation is evil, right? It is increasing the efficiency of this corporation and ensuring they have more money for lobbying power. It is the capacity to ensure that they can have a stronger foothold in politics, etc. Or even within politics, you have to accept donations to be able to run any kind of successful campaign and therefore be more willing to side with some of their kinds of concessions and political interests. Take note, these are things that cannot be accounted for within the calculation of the 80,000 hours for a couple of reasons. The first is that they only calculate the good that is done, meaning whatever is done by your salary, as opposed to them being unable to possibly calculate a lot of the evil things you're probably capable of. But secondly, even if they were able to, it is the fact that these are done in closed door meetings. These are done under the table and makes it difficult for researchers to be able to ensure you can live the most altruistic life possible as a result. And therefore, these are misadvisements. These are likely inaccurate calculations to where more good can be done as a result. Why do you care about the good? I think not just because you believe in it, but you see it as a sense of self-fulfillment. You see it as the meaning you have in your life and the purpose in which you are put in this world. Why is that dangerous? The first is simply there's such a large cognitive dissonance between your own sense of fulfillment, the reason you do work within your job, and the things you are doing and actively contributing to. Take note, just because you throw money at a charitable organization does not mean that you can wash away a lot of the evil things that you do as a result, just by mere participation within the structure. But secondly, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? At least on our side, any kind of participation means you are directly doing good already. On their side, any sort of good you do depends largely on success. Are you winning your political campaigns? Are you getting promoted and therefore gaining large salaries as a result and therefore can contribute more? This uncertainty at most means that you're unable to even certify you will do good because these calculations probably cannot ascertain how well you will do in a tense corporate environment. But thirdly, in a tense corporate environment, it is precisely seeing the visceral nature of the things that you do that changes how you enact and deal with stress. It is seeing that you are doing good into this world, that you are directly interacting with communities that need most of your help, that therefore mean you're willing to go through a lot of the hard stuff. And on both sides, there are hard things to do. On our side, you're probably giving up a corporate job. On their side, you're giving up a large chunk of your salary. On their side, you see you're giving up a large chunk of your salary, but you still see the Black family whose loan was denied because you participate in a structure that directly causes that. As opposed to on our side, when you directly work with local communities and ensure you can ascertain a better future for them within this organization. But thirdly, you're caught in this bind. And take note the environment that you work in, filled with all the individualistic people that government points out. It is within this work environment that you're probably encouraged to spend, not on these kinds of organizations, but on things like newer cars, things like luxury items, not because you want to, because that's the reason your coworkers are probably going to judge you if you don't dress well, if you don't have these things. Or you have to spend on fancy dinners with clients if you work in the financial industry, because that builds up your own credibility. A lot of success, I would agree, in this industry is face value, but you have to, in order to ensure you can get a higher salary in order to participate. Take note, every time you try and participate, it is either you don't spend on these things and feel the judgment of the people around you, or the loss of credibility from the people you serve, or every time you buy a new luxury item, it is blood money. You feel like it could have gone somewhere else. You feel like the opportunity cost, which is precisely the reason you justified your participation in the structure, should have gone to a better cause instead. I'll take CG.
This is an actor debate. If 80 hours cannot predict the actions and the impacts of whatever you do in terms of like the corporate world, why can this individual with so much amount of information asymmetry predict the kind of consequences his actions will have in the corporate world?
No. It's because, one, the bad things you do are not part of the calculation. But two, a lot of the bad things in the corporate world are hidden, as opposed to the direct good things that happen within NGOs and charitable organizations. So I think I pointed that out quite clearly. So because it's an actor debate, you're unlikely to get the sense of fulfillment you do from doing the good that you want to be able to do. But secondly, simply, where's more good done? Throwing money at an NGO, especially if you're just one individual, creates a very marginal change. And whatever increase in capital and promotion, etc., you posit on government implies a direct kind of competence and intelligence that you can get on opposition. I think what we do in opposition is not just increase the pool of money, which I think is marginal at best, but increase the efficiency of the money, because you can direct how the NGO is likely to act. You can do things like use data science and your knowledge on that to ensure it goes to the most altruistic outcome possible. You can do more research within these kinds of local communities that directly goes into these NGOs, rather than the potential patents that corporations and high research institutes are likely to be able to put on it. And here's the comparative, right? At best, it is one salary of one man that you change on government. On our side, every increasing action that you do to change the direction of where that pool of money goes impacts the entire pool of wealth and funding, and therefore increases the good that is marginally done on our side as a result as well, if that's something you care about. For both you and the good you want to do, it is far better on op. I'm very proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that speech. Now can I have the Deputy Prime Minister?
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, just give me a moment. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel noticed that there's been a mischaracterization of what is the nature of this profession. We don't think that individuals in these positions of corporatism or politics necessarily feel viscerally affected, right? We don't think that they're going to do things that are viscerally evil to them for them to get affected to the degree to which opening opposition is claiming. Sure, you might have to work for ExxonMobil. Sure, you might have to be conscious of the fact that your company is polluting the environment, or sure, you know that there's something wrong with what your corporate firm is doing, but we don't think that this is going to cause such a huge problem in your head. Why? Because we think that your vicinity or your ability to viscerally see the amount of change that you're doing is still going to satiate your mental health, right? Because when you can still sustain the meaning of your life when the orphanage that you are donating to sends you the report card of your ward that they're doing well in school, or when you get the pictures of the quality of life in these slums improving, you can viscerally, tangibly feel the impact that you have had on this world as a positive one. Or when you spend on someone's healthcare, that you can buy someone an organ that they were not able to afford, you can pay for people's treatment, you're able to fund a hospital to be able to save multiple people's life, and when they erect a statue in your name that you're able to cause a positive change for so many people in this particular form of part of society, we think you're still able to viscerally feel good about these things. Even if the amount of wealth and privilege you're going to amass is not to that degree, we're able to still get a sustained form of change. Secondly, on the idea that you're encouraged to spend on luxury, etc., we don't think that you're going to be like viscerally spending on things like cars or to extensively being luxurious, but to the degree to which you have to do these things to amass social capital for you to get a better salary, for you to be able to affect more utilitarian change, we think it's still okay. It's okay for you to indulge in the practices of your corporate life if that means you're going to create more change. Secondly, right, they really don't deal with the comparative of research or all of these other other fields that also involve these sorts of work, like politics, etc., does not really require you to be effectively a morally culpably wrong actor in and of itself. Doing research about things like gender studies or feminism does not really require you to be problematic actor in any sense of the form, right? We don't think that they have really been comparative to that degree. Secondly, we think in the degree to which where is mental peace better accrued, we think it's on their side that it's far worse, where you're directly not fulfilled because of the frustration of your impotence, that you're not able to cause any sort of change given that you have no capital. We are working for a human rights organization that's trying to fight China, but you're stonewalled by legal legislation that you or your organization can't do anything against. We think that there's huge amount of barriers to getting sort of change through altruistic organizations in and of itself. 3 reasons why. One, we think these organizations don't get large-scale public support to be able to create a huge amount of good. And at the point of time you're in those situations, you're viscerally exposed to the problems in that situation. That is, if you're working for these organizations, you're viscerally every day have to meet and shake the hands of people who are worst affected, vulnerable individuals. That is at the point of time you viscerally keep reflecting on your impotence to be able to create any sort of sustainable change for these individuals within these neighborhoods. Therefore, you feel a sense of powerlessness. We think that's problematic. So we think the lack of awareness about this cause is the reason why these things don't get public support. So this lack of awareness is remedied by wealth, remedied by like marketing, etc. Secondly, we think the amount of donors that can help change situations in these altruistic groups is a limited pool because not everyone is altruistic anymore, especially after the coronavirus where people don't have wealth themselves. We think there are competitions within these groups where the most visceral ones win out, or the ones related to identity win out, like organizations related to veterans or religious organizations. These are the things that win out in these groups. We think there's a limiting factor, or there's a cap on the amount of good work that you can do in altruistic organizations by wealth itself. We think that the focus is on remedying the consequences of the problem, right? This is the larger problem with this approach. We think the altruistic organizations act as stopgap remedies to problems instead of tackling the root cause, because often the root cause is structural in nature that these organizations really don't do anything to hedge against, because of their model itself, that they have to do things like create campaigns based on the work they did in terms of helping the poor person on the ground. They're really not tackling anything to do with the structural problems in and of itself, because you need that visceral footagery to drive that donations to your organization. We're not saying that is a perverse model, but that is the nature of the business that you do in and of itself. So we don't think the focus is really on causing the root cause. So the problem, we think you need institutional government power to remedy these things, and we think this is fulfilled.
I paused the timer. Can you repeat the last 10 seconds from 416?
Okay. Okay. 4, 3, 2, 1. We think that these altruistic organizations don't really do much to tackle the root cause of these problems. They're more focused on remedying the consequence of systematic problems. We think that these things are far better taken care of when you have things like government power or institutional power, which is far better achieved when you amass wealth. Why? We think 2 reasons. One, to climb the political or corporate ladder, you go through a lot, right? That is, first reason, you understand the incentives that cause the problems in the system in the first place. This allows you to donate smarter and donate in the right places to create the most amount of change. Given the fact that you are in this ecosystem and you're partaken in this ecosystem, you understand what are the specific incentives that are causing these problems, so you can try to remedy them in the smartest way. Secondly, it allows you to create networks with people in positions of power. This is important because of 2 reasons. One, you influence them to join the cause. Not everyone in these corporate ladders are extremely horrible or abhorrent people. There are still people who care about things that you can necessarily ask them to join your cause. This, if it's effectuated, it's a huge amount of wealth that you can generate. Secondly, you can rely on, even if they're in the worst case, they're not willing to join you or anything like that, you can still rely on them to get some changes done. You can call in for a favor for these groups, etc., to help your cause necessarily. So even if you can't necessarily reform them, you can still leverage them with this field. I'd like to take a POI from closing if they have anything.
Yes, yeah, I have a POI. So
Yep.
working 30 plus years to possibly tackle structural problems that you created is probably not the best thing for an altruistic conscience, right?
I don't think so, because we think that you're able to politically lobby, which is the 3rd reason. Even if you are not really causing change for 15 years, you're still donating to organizations that you believe are causing political change. That is, you're able to fund campaigns of politicians you agree with, and their good work is reflected in how you feel about yourself, because you understand that your campaign donation that was caused to that group directly, viscerally helped some other organization. And this is the most important contribution, because changing structures is the key to elevating oppression for most vulnerable groups. Like when you fund narratives narratives or fund think tanks to be able to create narratives to cause societal change or influence people to vote for the right parties that can help most vulnerable groups. We think it's far better in terms of how you feel about yourself as that individual when you're able to see that you're able to create some sort of consciousness or some sort of large-scale utilitarian benefit that you can help people directly. We think the most important factor is that when you have wealth, you can immediately help people on the ground. You can help minority groups, you can help women, you can help these people who need the most amount of help in the soonest manner possible. Therefore, we think it's the most visceral form of this person to self-actualize. We think we have proven to you many incentives about why this cannot be achieved in the other side, because we think the ability for you to fight the good fight when you're fighting as an individual who has no capital within these altruistic organizations, your limited scope of people who even listen to you is extremely narrow, because people who listen to you are people who already care about the cause. We think this is problematic because you need capital again to attract more people to this cause. We think the only way and the most important contribution in this debate is about who creates the most amount of change. In terms of utility, in the long run, we're able to create the most amount of change. In terms of short-term benefits as well, we've proven to you how you can fund people in and around your house itself to be able to create change. Extremely proud to propose.
Okay, thank you, Deputy, for that speech. Now can we have the Deputy Leader of the Opposition?
Hello, am I audible? Oh.
If you can speak up a little more,
Sorry,
that
am
would
I
be
audible?
great.
Is this audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay, nice. Give me a second. Just type your POIs, but if I don't take one by 6, just bug me via unmuting yourself. Okay. The most important question in today's debate is not about how much positive good you can do in society. It's a question of how much positive good you feel like you're doing in society, given that closing government rightly points out that this is an actor debate. That is why it's not only about how much good you do in the abstract, which I think is the opening government only focuses on, but rather how you calculate and appreciate the amount of good you do. Because to a degree, you're able to believe that you do more good than not. If you're an altruistic-minded person, you're probably more happy or fulfilled. And if you don't do as much good, even if you're technically doing good, but you're not able to perceive that or judge that, then presumably you're not able to gain fulfillment from it. That's why that is the most important value, and that's what I'll structure my second part of my issues on. But before that, I want to deal with their main claim about why we actually do more absolute good under our side of the house. So their main claim is that we make a lot of money, and when you make a lot of money, you can do a lot of things in this world, and therefore you're able to make a lot of change. The first question is whether or not they will actually make that a lot of money. I concede the jobs they take are high salary and high paying, but they don't deal with the nuances provided by Miko. The first being that if you want to be as high salary and high paying, a lot of times it requires you to spend a lot of that money in doing things like developing social capital and making yourself look rich, look smart, because that's how you gain credibility with other clients, etc. That is why for you to rise to the positions of power, you have to do a lot of things like spend on luxury goods, like do a lot of evil actions. Their only response is we're okay with taking that threshold. Note that social capital is relative, right? If you have a new designer bag that's 1 year old, if someone else has a better designer bag, you'll still be judged in the workplace. You'll still be made fun of. You'll still be seen as lesser, or you have their older car. So you have to constantly keep on spending. So it's unclear whether or not, even if you make a lot of money, you're able to match that money with the amount of savings you're able to get. Notably, this is the failure of the 80,000 hours model, right? Because the motion inflow side assumes that you'll be expected to donate a lot of the money that you earn. To a degree that not able to donate a lot of the money, that mechanism already falls. But secondly, we would suggest, to a degree that you don't do these actions, then you're not able to rise into the positions of power. Then you're not able to be popular. Then if you're the altruistic person you say that calls out abuses and tells people not to do the wrong things, you're likely to be isolated in the workplace, and therefore you won't get the promotions you need to get the high salary that you want. That's why a large chunk of their case, which is reliant on huge funding, is unlikely to happen. But let's assume that they have relatively large funding. Why is that still insufficient for them to be able to do good? The first thing they say is you'll donate a lot. The comparative here is that while we agree you as an individual, if you work in an NGO, won't be able to donate a lot, you're able to do things like better marketing campaigns. You're better able to do things like redirect where donations are to make them more efficient, cut on costs because you're likely to get a leadership role if you're smart enough to be considered to be a financial or investment banker in the first place. This is important. because they never tell us why the amount of money you're able to get from other donors is significantly less than the amount of money you're able to donate by yourself. And we would suggest it's significantly greater, because while you're able to become an investment banker, presumably you're not the billionaires of the world who are able to make the vast majority of the money. And the very least, you're able to, especially if you're the altruistic banker who's not willing to do cutthroat practices to get to the top. But secondly, noticeably, donations are not an inherent good that are fungible all throughout. A lot of donations that people make are done in useless causes or inefficient causes. That's why we have the rise of things like effective altruism, because people are persuaded by things like marketing, persuaded by fake data, or persuaded by the selection bias of the available NGOs they have. Noticeably, if you spend your entire career developing a trend for working for multinational corporations, your acuity to be able to determine which NGOs are good and are effective is likely to decrease and are able to be successful. Versus if you were in an NGO where you're certain that the donations, where your money actually goes and able to trace them, are likely to be successful. And that's why even if you have less monetary donations, it goes to more effective causes. Secondly, they suggest you'll fund businesses. One, I would just suggest that this benefits at best upper middle class individuals with enough acuity and capacity for them to start businesses already. Secondly, a lot of NGOs also fund businesses. It's that NGOs are more tailored to SMEs and smaller businesses, versus if you have a multinational corporation training, it is unclear whether you're able to make businesses that are more effective under their side. Lastly, they say you're able to change structures because you have access to data. This doesn't respond to the fact that a lot of times, if you have access to the data, it's probably because you're also liable, right? You also take part in these particular deals. You'd also take part and you kept quiet for long periods of time for you to have access to these positions of power, which means that even if you have access to the data, it's unlikely for you to be able to act on it, because people can blackmail you to not talk about it, because you yourself will be put in jail. You yourself will be held liable. And therefore, whether you have access to data is unlikely to be the most important thing. Versus on the our side, if you want structural change, you have things like NGOs which can rally, call for politicians. And notably, the structural change is better on our side. And this will deal with the argument coming from DPM. The first is, at best, if you become very, very successful under their side, you change one business, one law firm, one potential political party, but you don't change the entire structure as a whole. Comparatively, if you're successful as a human rights organization or an NGO, you're far more likely to change the entire structure and we're able to get change. But secondly, we would suggest that it assumes that you fight for it, and we explain why you're less likely to fight for it on their side of the house. But secondly, even if you do believe that you do a lot of good, you have to qualify that by two things. The first is the qualification of uncertainty. It is possible that you fail in your job, right? You get fired from your investment banking job, maybe because you're doing good, maybe because you wanted to be a whistleblower, and therefore all your streams of money that you potentially wanted to do in the future diminish, versus a direct giving under our side of the house, which is clear to give money again and again. But secondly, it is also cancelled out or negated by the evil actions that you do. They don't really respond to it aside from saying politicians don't have to do evil actions. Guys, they have to vote for immoral policies. They have to do things like vote buys in some instances in developing countries. It's unclear what a lie to their constituents. It's unclear that they not have to do evil actions. Why is this important? We first said that this NGO, the 80,000 hours organizations, unlikely to calculate for these things, and therefore the calculation that you're basing it off is unlikely to be there. But secondly, given that there's a lot of uncertainty because you can't fully predict how much evil you're able to do, there's a chance that you become a net evil in the world, even if you believe that you have a chance to have higher net returns. This is important versus working in an NGO where you're relatively certain that you have high net returns. Because at the very least, under our side of the house, we're certain that you'll never be evil, versus under their side where you're crippled by the uncertainty of not being evil. But lastly, even if you believe that you do more absolute good under their side, why can't they still win the debate? The first is, the absolute good that you're doing is done by people far away, for people you don't really see. So the empathy gap is very, very large. Secondly, it is done on an irregular basis, meaning you spend more time in your job knowing that you're doing evil and constantly doing evil versus being able to get a yearly report from your NGOs. Thirdly, your ability to appreciate statistics and numbers, which a lot of NGOs use, are likely to be things in the vacuum and abstract versus the clear evil you see you doing under our side of the house. That is why even if you believe that the numbers add up, that you do more good in the world, you're far more likely to be unfulfilled. But secondly, they just assume that altruistic people are utilitarian in nature, that they care about computing costs and benefits. A lot of them are probably Kantian or people who believe in the ends are just not justifying the means, and therefore the active evil that you do cancels out any potential good you do under their side of the house. That's why even if you do absolutely good, you're less likely to see yourself as good, which is the most important actor to this debate. We do more good under our side, but at the very least, we make people feel more fulfilled, which is the most important goal. That's why we're very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that speech. That concludes the opening half of this debate. Can we now welcome the government member to bring us their extension?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Perfect. Just give me 10 seconds, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think the deadlock in opening half is about where exactly is it that money is spent most efficiently and what exactly does it matter to you as an individual. We think OG just lists the impact of more capital without one, engaging with O and their entire analysis about this extra capital being inefficient. And second, they never frame this debate around an individual. They largely debated it as if this house believes that motion. We think O's case on the other hand is largely uncomparative, and I'll prove that to you in my speech. One, let's first understand and engage with O directly to understand why is it that structurally NGOs and charities are problematic and inefficient bodies in and of themselves. One, we think there's a policy paralysis within these NGOs. That is to say, you have two types of organizations. One, the large NGOs, where you've got huge amounts of structure and a sort of a corporate-like structure in place, which means as an individual, your agency to be able to create change and for you to be able to advocate for issues that matter to you is largely minimal because you're caught between the red tape and the structure that exists in the large NGOs. Second, smaller NGOs, which you probably might found yourself or like literally go and like start your own charity, the ability for you to still create change is minimal because you still rely on large number of volunteers to come in there and help you, which means you're largely seen as an equal amongst many people and they all want to go and cause change as per their own value functions, as per what matters to them the most, which means policy paralysis is something which happens on their side. But second, even on their best case in opposition, when you do get resources, there's a decreasing marginal utility of those resources. Why is this true? We think one, people are risk averse. They only tend to donate to the very large charities that have been established for so many years, which means on the comparative as an individual, around 20 to 30 years of your life goes in accumulating resources and capital, in being seen as a reputable charity who people can actually go and donate to, which means it's extremely hard for you to gain the legitimacy which they need on their side. But third, if you actually want to work in something like a niche issue, which people don't really know about, they're very unlikely to actually go and donate in those issues because they simply want to go and create the maximum possible good for the minimum amount of money that they have, which means they are risk averse in spending money in niche and new charities who have no proven track record, which means it's extremely unlikely for them to ever get money on their side of the house. But even if they do get money, and we think the only case where that's possible is if one, the charity gets the traction and recognition, or if two, the charity works in an issue which is extremely popular and which people know about. Even in that circumstance, there's a decreasing marginal utility with more amount of money that you get, which means the amount of people you're actually able to help decreases and is not proportionate anymore. Because notice this, most of the money then goes into things like building a new office, hiring new people, etc., which means there's no tangible impact on ground which you're able to create with that extra money which you get on their side. But also this, right? Notice this. So huge amount of resource crunch within NGOs itself, which means as an individual, as for someone who's extremely altruistic, I don't have the best possible ability to create the maximum change I can because I'm constantly relying on donors, constantly relying on volunteers showing up on the weekend to actually help people. I'm constantly relying on government support and governments giving me permission to actually go and open the community kitchen that I want, which means you're constantly looking outwards and depending on people around you to actually create change, which means structurally charities and NGOs literally hamstring you in your ability to actually cause change. Why then is O's case so uncomparative when they say, oh, for personal fulfillment, you need to do evil things? We think one, you need to do evil things on their side of the house as well, because you still need to pay off local politicians and local cooperators when you want to buy or when you want to go and like start a community kitchen for example, or you want to get permission to actually hold a protest, etc. Second, even on their side, to get the money that you want, you still need to go to the same people in the capitalist society. You still need to go to people and get oil money. You still need to go to people who literally go and oppress other people and cause environmental problems because they are the ones who will donate to your charity, which means the source of money and the kind of oppression which happens does not change on either side. But third, their entire argument about luxury is still going to take place on their side because you still need to go and network with high net worth individuals. You still need to go and talk to people who are extremely rich and who you rely on for funding, which means you still need to dress in the best possible way, wear luxury clothes because you need to interact in the high social circles which they talk about, which means their case is largely uncomparative. But even if that's not true, and even if on that best case, this person is responsible, we think one, most individuals in the corporate world live in sit in usually cushy and like AC offices where they literally have no connect with the real world. They don't know what's happening in the factories and the kind of environmental damage which is happening in say Nigeria, for example, because they literally sit in a cozy office somewhere else, which means the moral culpability which you have as an individual is not direct. So I as an individual don't have the ability to perceive the extent of my actions, which means by O's entire analysis themselves, when they say, oh, 80,000 hours can't go and realize the impacts of your actions in the corporate world, we're not sure why one particular individual can then do that, because literally you're just relying on, you're literally one cog in a wheel in a machine in the capitalistic world, which means the amount of information you have about all the actions of the company is extremely limited on their side. We're not sure why you can do anything. Look at the individual framing they give you now, something OG misses about. As an individual, where exactly is it you're likely to feel more amounts of burnout when working for a charity? Within one, you're constantly disappointed as an individual to not get funding. You're struggling to help all the people you want because you simply don't have enough money to feed everyone you care about. You're constantly frustrated that people in positions of power, that people in society don't respond the same way that you do. You start questioning the fact that you can even create change in the first place, which means on their side, the ability for these individuals to actually have the mental ability and the motivation to create change is marginal at best, because you're constantly met with rejection. You're constantly met with rejections from people who don't give you money. Second, you're always surrounded by people who are constantly suffering, individuals who need help. It's so emotionally taxing and psychologically traumatic for you to see a mother not able to take care of a child dying from cancer, and you can't even fund them simply because you're relying on some corporate person to come and give you the money. The amount of paralysis which you feel and the psychological trauma you experience is so much more, which means as an individual, you simply get emotionally traumatized. But third, you constantly feel constrained. Notice this, most issues in charities require long-term funding. You cannot expect to create long-term change like OG tells you without the framing we give you in terms of creating sustained funding. That is to say, if you want the child in underprivileged background to actually stand for himself and get a job, you can't just withdraw his funding when he goes to high school, which means it's important for charities to be able to get constant sources of funding and not rely outwards. On the comparative on our side, as an individual, you have the ability to constantly fund issues you care about. You have the ability to research on things like fertilizers, like medicines, to make that cheap and accessible to people, which means on the comparative on opposition, they might create short-term change at best, but on our side, we create structural change by actually changing the way people in positions of power work. But second, by actually investing in things like research, investing in things like fertilizers, etc. But third, we give you the exclusive framing as an individual, where you're likely to get burned out on side opposition and drop out of charities in the first place because the many structural issues which we uniquely give to you inside closing government. We're very proud to win this debate.
Thank you for that speech. Now can I welcome the opposition member?
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, I can hear you.
Starting in 3, 2, wait. Yep, starting in 3, 2, 1. What is valuable to this individual is not the amount of change that happens externally, and OO was right when they mentioned it's how exactly they feel about the good they have done and how they perceive themselves as. But the value in it but in fact, the nuance of it all is that there's a value in seeing yourself as an altruistic person, because I think that the biggest intention of a good person is to see themselves as good and to be able to maintain this good and altruistic nature within them. My first argumentation will be, how do we maintain this altruism inside our world, and how that is fundamentally the reason as to why this person will end up being gratified. But before that, a few clarifications between the two sides and what exactly this debate is about. The first thing to understand about the comparative underside government is that this 80,000 hour thing is basically measuring the marginal benefit that you get to give to the external world, or to the world essentially. It is likely to mean that what it measures by is how much impact you can do. These are things like, for example, working on the climate crisis, working on the health crisis, etc. This essentially means that it's true that you are unable to measure what exactly good you have done. You are unable to see a lot of these things. The contrast under our world is very simple. It's direct change. They cannot argue to you that we do not cause impact, but rather the impact that we cause might be smaller in size, but rather we are able to actually see the viscerality of our impacts. This looks like, for example, building small scale or local NGOs, like my friends building NGOs every other 2 days, like Dear Her, sexual harassment bill and stuff. Secondly, it's things like, for example, charity organizations that you're part of. No, you don't need extreme things like, for example, building investment, this resource crunch might be a thing to some things, but it can also be as simple as having an orphanage or teaching refugees in already built up schools and built up things, etc. All of these are fundamental ways in which you can have a direct change and direct impact to a lot of these people. Therefore, there is a likelihood to succeed, but yes, we can agree that the impacts might be more smaller, but are going to be a bit more close to home under our vote, right? So that's between the two things. The second I'm going to do is, what exactly does this individual essentially want? It's true that we want to perceive that we are making a contribution. Well, essentially this comes because humans are innately self-gratifying, right? We want the idea of self-gratification. We want to be able to see the changes we do, and we want to make sure that we understand the chain of how we were the primary impact of why a certain change is likely to happen. But the importance of this fulfillment, and this is where our primary extension comes from, is the idea that we want to feel like we're altruistic people. Note that as this altruistic person, they're not horrible human beings, but there are a few fundamental elements of altruism that we haven't considered in this debate. The first, that it's not a constant. In fact, altruism is a fleeting criteria or characteristic inside a human being. Essentially what it means is that this person or this individual has a capacity to become an evil or a worse human being in the future, which makes them not gratify themselves to begin with. Secondly, altruism is random at best, right? The amount of people that are altruistic in this world are very minimal, because usually what gets you there are things that are random. For example, how you were raised or your life experiences, right? All of this essentially means that altruism becomes a very scarce or very sporadic resource that we have under our world. I think it's best that when a resource, or like when altruism exists, we ought to maintain it, right? For a few fundamental reasons, and this is the overarching reason also. Number one, because we want to ensure gratification inside ourselves, that we are a consistently good person. But secondly, it's that altruism needs to be echoed and amplified among society. In order for us to feel like we have a net good, it's also making and producing more altruistic people inside society. I think that is also a fundamental way in which we change the world, which fundamentally makes us more gratified. The first argumentation, how do we maintain altruism under our own? Before I move on to what it like sort of building up, I'm going to destroy as to why this 80,000 hour option will diminish your altruism throughout the years, right? The first reason is complicity, right? All sort of touched on this, but concluded it very differently. It's things like, for example, the idea that you have to climb up the corporate structure prior to even getting any more change. It is true what closing government says, that you cannot measure your evil, therefore you feel nothing. But the worst part is you can also not measure your good. That's the second thing. The change is oftentimes distance. You are unable to see the change that you have done, and there's a lack of emotional attachment to your cause. For example, I cry about climate crisis every day, but if I truly wanted to make a change, I'd probably work on the health crisis, right? Because of this unrelatability, and because it takes so long for you to essentially want to do change, and because you've committed a lot of evils in the process, it essentially means that you're more likely not going to feel anything about it in the end. But lastly, it's also the long wait. It's the idea that if you as an individual working in the corporate structure, imagine like a fresh graduate, it's going to take you a long time before you get enough money to donate substantially to a certain body, right? This essentially all adds up to the fundamental lead to an apathetical feeling towards a change. And this is when you know you fucked up as an individual, because you lose your altruistic nature, and therefore you cannot create more change. And you're unable to feel gratified from the change and good that you essentially have to do, is going to do. So now you produce a human being that no longer gives a fuck, but the world becomes worse because you feel like there is a lost cause in the causes that you make, because the world is already substantially getting worse as you are sitting there trying to make money from Goldman Sachs, right? And this is also a response to like OG's argumentation regarding how you're going to amplify your work, etc. You're not likely to do this when it's no longer long-term and you feel like you are fleeting. The comparative under our work is simple. Altruism is more likely to be felt when you feel humbling experiences. We get this when you have a hands-on form of charity, when you teach refugee kids, when you go to refugee camps. All of this makes you understand and see the issues far better, and it makes you feel like a good person because you feel you are close to those that are vulnerable. Secondly, you feel like you are attached and associated to a good character. You feel that because if I'm inherently an asshole, I'm not likely going to make a change in the world. And therefore, when you feel like you are a good person, you're more likely to give back. And therefore, it becomes a cyclical idea that you feed yourself with altruistic ideas. And lastly, it's a more relatable issue, right? You're also more likely to commit to it because you can see where your money goes to. If my mother has cancer, I'll work on cancer, even though I know that it's intractable. Any POIs before that? OG.
Through your choice, you're actively allowing another individual who isn't altruistic to work at the MNC and not donate at all. Won't this hurt your conscience?
No, it won't, because I'm busy doing other good things. Yeah, so moving on, right? Well, altruism is crucial, but also if you feel like you're complicit in the terms of other worse people, I'll tell you that we can actually amplify altruism under our. So the potential of a good person being an MNC is far higher. How do we get that? Note that altruism needs to be harbored in terms that if I'm an asshole and I'm friends with Erteza over here, if he's good, he's more likely going to make me good. In order for you to get that, you must maintain your altruism first. It essentially means that you have to do close range, smaller, direct changes. And when you're able to do that, you're more likely to echo this to a lot of your friends. Having smaller, close range NGOs means that you get to change the minds of people far more. Posting "you are not alone" on Instagram as a form of change is going to change the ideologies of fundamentally people around you, because you're more likely to do hands-on and close range changes. This fundamentally means that the probabilities of you changing a potential person working in a corporate world or working in MNC is far higher, because then you get to able to actually harbor altruism as opposed to trying to make social impact, when at the end of the day, you're more likely having to wait far longer in your corporate job in order for you to make any semblance of change.
Okay, thank you for that speech. Now can we have the last speaker on the government side? Whip when you're ready.
Hi, am I audible?
Can you just test your audio by saying a sentence?
Hi, can you hear me now?
Okay, perfect.
All right, excellent. Just give me 1 second. Hi, yeah, so I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Here's how I'm going to structure my speech. First, I'm going to tell you why closing government's contributions far outweigh the mechanisms that you got from opening government that did not focus on the individual. Second, I'm going to tell you why closing opposition's concerns are actually worse on their side with regards to preserving altruism and optimism, and why closing government on weighing is better able to preserve that. Finally, I'm going to tell you why opening opposition's case was incredibly uncomparative and why they fall out of this debate. So first, on opening government. The issue with opening government was that while they have a lot of interesting impacts, they fail to mechanize those impacts to you from the frame of the individual. That is the kind of mechanisms that the only mechanism with regards to the individual that you get from opening government is that on our side, you are likely to be able to do some change, and that's why all of the concerns on opposition bench magically fall out. Notice that closing government's frame responds to the opposition bench frame in much more comprehensive manner, where we focus on the experiences of the individuals through multiple ways. The first was through the structure that you have in most NGOs where you as an individual you are working. That is to say, what is likely to happen is that when you go ahead and work in an NGO, if it is large scale, you have very little agency in terms of the kind of things that you care about, and that in the ability of you to get your NGO to do the kind of things that are most close to your heart, the things you care about the most. And if you decide to go your own route, make your own NGO, the fact, because it's a very, very small scale organization, means that A, you have a really huge resource crunch, and B, that you end up getting a lot more policy paralysis within your NGO, because everyone thinks they have a say, everyone thinks that they are like Jesus Christ and want to like make a huge impact on the world. Everyone has this huge altruistic ego that they want to care about, which means that your ability to get effective change significantly reduces on that side. The second more important frame that comes from closing government is the frame of consistency at the end of Jamal's speech. That is to say, on the opposition bench, you rely continuously on the will and the will of others and the charity of others in order for you to be successful. On our paradigm, you are able to consistently create a change, and that is able to get the change that opening government wanted to talk about in a much better way. That is to say, in the opposition benches paradigm, what happens is that most individuals like end up like looking for money, and when they cannot find that money, they have to abandon their cause. They have to give up on the people they were giving hope, and that is where these people end up dying. On our paradigm, when you have a consistent huge source of income, when you are consistently donating, when you are consistently working towards research goals that can lead to a huge amount of change, is where you are able to consistently create a much better change, to consistently create a much better argument. That is why we think that because we focus on what you as an individual are likely to feel like on opening government and closing government on both paradigms, we take this debate over the opening half. Next, then let's come to closing opposition. So the main idea coming from closing opposition is that you want to preserve the kind of altruism that happens, which happened, and they claim that they cannot happen because you cannot measure change. We think that we can still measure change in the closing government world. Hey, first, you can probably still visit these people on your weekends and on your vacations. You can still get those humbling experiences that they talk about on their paradigm. There is no reason on closing opposition to believe why that needs to be a full-time job for you to do in order to get the kind of change that they want to talk about. Secondly, then you can probably see things like pictures, and you can see reports of the kind of change that you have made, which means that you can still continue and trace back that causal link that was that mechanism and see the fact that you have created some change on our paradigm. Third, you can probably still interact with the people and know about the suffering that continues to exist. I don't need to be in Africa to know that a lot of countries in Africa have serious problems with poverty. And I don't need to be in Africa personally to know that my money has helped people and caused a lot more children, for example, to not go hungry a particular night. Fourth, you have a lot more incentive to donate when you can actually see your money being used by charities that have a background, that has structures in place where they are working, instead of probably traveling to another country and then building up a lot of work there from ground up. Closing opposition never responds to the structural reasons as to why charities are inefficient on the asset that I've already talked about. Things like the paralysis within members, the fact that it's really hard to get money, the difficulty in prioritizing who to help. What that means is that the kind of altruism that they're going to talk about is likely to die on that paradigm when you simply go ahead every single day and you see that the kind of change that you're doing, despite spending a huge amount of time every single week, you are barely able to help any people. And in order for you to help people, you need to go ahead and spend a huge amount of resources, like getting money with the kind of really rich people who opening opposition claims are incredibly evil. And the fact that you just cannot help all the people in the world, this certainly means that you feel like your actions aren't doing anything, that no matter what you do, the number of people you are going to help is just going to be a small drop in the ocean. And because it is personal, because it is visceral, that is where it ends up becoming much worse, especially in the contingency that closing government has proved, in which you are likely to fail. That is just when you don't have money and you need to pull out your operations, when you need to give one less kid food because you just don't have that much food, is precisely where you are likely to feel much worse about yourself, because what you pride yourself on is the ideal of being altruistic, or the ideal of helping people as possible, and turning away people for help is where this altruism is much more likely to turn into jaded cynicism in the closing opposition world. That is why we think closing government is much more able to maintain the kind of close range relation, is much more likely to get the kind of change and to maintain the long term and avoid burnout in the long term, which ensures that our operations are sustained for a long time. Finally, then let's come to opening opposition and understand why their case is really uncomparative. So the main premise of opening opposition's case is first that corporations are really evil, and therefore you feel really bad by contributing to them. First of all, I'm just not sure how true this is. There is no idea or no analysis from the opposition when to believe why doing algorithmic trading is such a huge evil, or why filling data sheets or building stochastic models is something that's really bad. Secondly, then notice how this doesn't respond to a lot of the other mechanisms that closing government gave you in terms of things like you doing research in cancer, or you discovering better fertilizer, which again notice is much more significant than opening governments sociology frame, because the discovery of ammonia probably brought a lot more people out of poverty than sociology. Secondly, then, even if they are evil, if these corporations are really evil, this is largely uncomparative, because again, notice that these are the people with the most amount of money. And if your organization is to succeed, you need to cater to these same organizations. You need to ask them to give the CSR to the causes that you believe in, which means that you end up giving these organizations some legitimacy, and therefore that feeling of evil is likely to be uncomparative, of contributing to evil is likely to be uncomparative on both sides. Third, then, we don't understand why participating in these corporations is going to affect you so badly. Notice that, again, even if it's true that these corporations are doing some evil things, you are still likely a cog in the wheel and not have a huge amount of individual responsibility with regards to whatever is happening, right? On the comparative, when you are failing at helping people every single day is where you likely feel much worse. What this therefore means is that with regards to this feeling of helplessness and this feeling of personal benefit is actually much better on the closing government side, when we give people a consistent path as to how they are likely to get change. Finally, notice that with regards to by going to fancy restaurants in order to get corporate support, notice again that's uncomparative, because you need to get that on both sides. In either world, we think that closing government is proves to you in the best possible way why we need to, what the individual ought to do and where the individual is more likely to live a fulfilled life. I'm incredibly proud to propose.
Okay, thank you for that speech. Now can we have the last speech of this debate? Opposition rep.
Hi, I'll just do a quick mic check. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I'll start in a bit. Three, two, one. The reason as to why our extension is extremely important in this debate is that it provides the fundamental prerequisite to a lot of the impacts that everyone is talking about. So if you're listening to a lot of what is being said on our opening opposition, opening government, closing government, it seems the debate is largely judged by impacts, considering how much change you can do, what you can bring, etc. Our extension was able to do two things in this debate. Number one, talk about how in order for impacts to happen, altruism has to be maintained on some consistent level because oftentimes it is fleeting. The second thing that we talked about is the nature of the causes that you're likely to pick, and why is it that only in CO's causes you have a more visceral reality of success than you do in any high impact cause that you're going for on government side. I'll get more on that later. The two things that I'm going to talk about in this debate is, number one, I'm going to analyze altruism, where it's better maintained, because CG conceded that this is extremely important and tried to deal with the fact that it might be a fleeting thing. Number two, I'm going to analyze change and who gets this better. Firstly, let's analyze altruism. So this is how the government split went, right? So you had OG talking about impacts that were highly contingent on being able to acquire lots of wealth. And rightfully so, they got shat on by opening opposition and even their own closing. But the problem that closing government then fell into was that they ran an entirely negative case, which was largely premised on the technicalities of how charities work. And then they went on to, in their positive extension, fall into the same trap of opening government, where they had these similar impacts with the same level of vagueness surrounding how you get to those. This is why both of them are extremely problematic. Let's deal with CG's case first, concerning policy paralysis and the internal mechanisms for what would make a charity bad. So these are the reasons as to why they tried to argue that there are no outcomes on our world. Firstly, policy paralysis. This is so difficult to buy, considering that it is very difficult to just believe from the get-go. The amount of analysis surrounding this argument is very limited. The argument that they provided was some vague idea that because policies are so difficult to do, considering how big certain impacts can be, they will oftentimes never see the light of day, or that there might be too much disagreement internally. The problem with this is, number one, it assumes that these policies are very difficult to make. Oftentimes what charities do is that they have a targeted approach to one specific cause. So for example, you have things like building welfare, building shelters, etc. Very few charities actually take up multiple different causes, because NGOs and charities, in order to be successful, have to have some level of specialization. Specialization in and of itself mitigates a lot of the harms that government is talking about, because policy paralysis does not necessarily happen when you have a group of like-minded individuals that already have a target in mind when coming up with a policy. That is literally how most charities, big and small, work in terms of being able to assess their progress. But number two, they try to argue that they are averse to risk, so this is a bad thing. Why is this a bad thing? If you are going to make strategic approaches with your charity on things that have better or more statistically high likelihood of an impact in certain communities, I think that's an objectively better thing to do. The third thing that they're talking about is that you will be burnt out because there's consistent suffering. Now, here's why this burnt out argument is problematic. I think this definitely applies to me, because I'm not altruistic, but I don't think this applies to an altruistic person who by nature is an individual that is willing to put themselves in a position in which they want to do good for the world. Or these are people that see the good in other people and want to actively contribute to the rest of the world. So I think by virtue of the adequate characterization for what an altruistic person is, the likelihood of a burnout happening is simply a lot less by virtue of the fact that they want to put themselves there. But secondly, also note that when you work in charities over time, you build some kind of resistance to seeing things that might be potentially troubling. For example, if I go into an old folks home as a regular person and I see a lot of people suffering, I might get disturbed and want to leave. The same is not true for people who actually work there, because they see those people on a day-to-day basis. The same thing happens when you work at a charity. You're not likely to be burnt out by the image that you wanted to go there and help out and that you see on a day-to-day basis. This argument makes no sense. But lastly, is our extension unique in this particular debate? CG tried to argue that you can still maintain altruism working in Goldman Sachs or whatever, because you can visit them on on the weekends. All right, this is so problematic for a few reasons. Number one is that it forgets to respond to the analysis under eyesight. Oftentimes when you're working in like the corporate sector or banks, even if you're not doing anything explicitly evil, the problem with this is that number one, there is an explicit lifestyle change. You get absorbed into a lifestyle in which you are doing one specific thing over and over. Note, visiting an old folks home or a charity organization is completely antithetical to what you are doing in your job scope. So to be able to say that people can have the capacity to do both, juggle working at Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, etc., while maintaining your altruism and visiting old folks homes during the weekends and homeless shelters, is so crazy to ask of an individual that has to be absorbed into one type of lifestyle. It is significantly easier to do when you've already been absorbed into the lifestyle of an altruistic person, because it is only natural that you're going to be visiting people who are suffering on a day-to-day basis. Next, let's analyze change. CJ tried to argue that you don't have the money and you're likely to fail in this particular case, right? Now, this is where they've ignored the crucial framing coming under our side, which is the nature of the impacts in this particular debate. There are two impacts that we were the only ones able to analyze in this debate. Firstly, is that the motion allows us direct small changes versus whatever Gov has to argue, which if you read the info slide, literally says things like external factors have also got to be influenced by what you're doing in a high-paying salary. So presumably, it's about things that are very high impact, right? Things that obviously need a lot of money to change. So you're talking about things like climate change, possible pandemics, etc. The problem with this, and by the way, this also falls in line with CG's analysis, because they're talking about things like research and think tanks. These things are only relevant for very, very big problems. So this is where the likelihood of success comes into this debate, because in order for CG to be able to prove those very high impacts, it has to be beyond just being able to fund a particular think tank, but rather you have to analyze the statistic likelihood of it, even if you were able to amass a lot of capital versus our direct small-term impact. So this is how we get change significantly better. Number one, even though our change is not large scale, it is oftentimes direct and it is extremely visceral. And this is important for a few reasons. Number one is that you're obviously going to hedge your bets on charities that are, trustable. But secondly, it's also charities that have a direct impact. So for example, paying a homeless shelter obviously means that a homeless person gets to stay there the very next night. But number two, in terms of maintaining altruism, you get small bursts of happiness throughout this entire process when you're seeing little change happen on a day-to-day basis. This is why it is extremely important in keeping your altruism and potentially influencing other people to also become altruistic. In order for this to happen, you need to see small bursts of change happening regularly. And also note that if you're working with various NGOs and charities, you are hedging your bets on multiple different charities and organizations. So over time, the likelihood of them having some level of change is significantly higher than whatever Gov is arguing, which is highly speculative in nature. If you are going to buy what Gov is saying, you have to buy that in 20, 30 years, you're going to amass crazy levels of capital. And number two is that you hedge all of that on a high impact cause. It is also going to have the same level of likelihood of success and the same likelihood of maintaining your altruism, as opposed to small term, small scale projects that can boost your altruism, because it is more likely to see success happen on a day-to-day basis, even if you aren't doing all that much. For all these reasons, we're the only team that maintains altruism and has change that actually matters, even if it's small. Supremely proud to oppose.
Thank you, everyone, for that fine debate. So we wrap up this round, and you'll